You get the items?
Sure do. Got 'em. Right here.
Oh, wait. Where's the slipcovers?
Throw 'em away.
What? Why?
Useless trash. What are you gonna do with a bunch of paper?
Hello and thank you for clicking on my video. Now today we're going to be going over another franchise in my movie collection, and it's going to be on the 2 Mummy movies plus the Scorpion King on 4K Blu-ray. So I'm not going to be reviewing the movies themselves, but I am going to be talking about the packaging of the movie, the image quality of the discs, the sound quality, and maybe just a few tidbits here and there. And for this one, I am going to be making a bit of a comparison to their Blu-ray versions, which are also included in their 4Ks. We're going to be discussing these 3 movies in chronological order rather than release order. So the first one up is going to be The Scorpion King on 4K Blu-ray. So The Scorpion King was released back in 2002, and it was directed by Chuck Russell, but the screenplay was by Stephen Sommers, and Stephen Sommers has been involved in all of these Mummy movies that I'm going to be discussing, as well as Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. Now, regarding the packaging, it is actually a very standard packaging. They're all going to be standard packaging, but what I do like about the slipcover is that it does have a little bit of a shine. Now, it's not going to be like, say, the glossy finishes of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World or Dune or No Time to Die. It's just going to be mainly like actually the printing itself is just more reflective, I guess. Even though this part right here in the lettering, even though it looks embossed, it's actually flat, but it does look really nice when it reflects against the light. Now, as far as the images go, they're going to be the same, so the slipcover and this is not going to be any different, which, you know, I guess I would have liked some alternate artwork for these, because back in their previous releases, like say when they got, I think, special editions such as the Mummy ones, they would have different covers, but I don't ever remember the first Scorpion King ever having any different covers, so I guess that might just be too much to ask. But, you know, I am a collector. I always like alternative artworks. Now, as for the image quality, I want to say that the Scorpion King probably has the most benefit on being on 4K, but that's not because of how sharp the movie is or how much better the colors are. It's mainly because its Blu-ray release did have a little bit of blown out highlights. The blacks weren't as good. So the 4K kind of helps to even it all out. The skin tones look a little bit more natural. The color palette is a little bit more evened out between the highlights and the darks. Like, for example, when in the Blu-ray, some of the highlights on Balthazar would show on his skin during the daytime. Sometimes it'd be just a little bit blue, and on the 4K, it would even that more out. So that part of the highlight on his skin would not be as blown out. Extreme close-ups, like such as when Matthias was buried in the sand pit. That extreme close-up of his face, you could very clearly see, you know, all of his pores and all the little individual hairs. But image quality wise, it's just a little bit sharper than the Blu-ray. It's not much more detail. So detail wise, it's not really why you're going to want to get this discs. It's more as in, if you didn't like the look of it in the Blu-ray, the 4K does help process the image better. So it's just more pleasant to look at. Everything is just processed better, but it's not processed to what I would say the standard of a 4K should be. So the 4K disc for the Scorpion King is more along the lines of just a better Blu-ray release. Audio-wise, the movie was in DTS:X and the Blu-ray was in DTS HD. Sound mixing-wise, the movie is pretty alright mixed. It doesn't sound very much different from the Blu-ray from when I heard it. Maybe the audio was just a little bit cleaner, but as far as like mixing wise, it doesn't sound much different from its Blu-ray release. They're not bad mixes. Obviously everything still sounds fine. The score is still at a nice level. All the dialogue is still very audible, and all the sound effects, you know, still come out clean. It's just not anything amazing or to write home about. It's just pretty much your standard release. So next up is my favorite and the best of these three movies, The Mummy, starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. This movie was released in 1999 and it got its 4K release in 2017. Packaging wise, this movie is very similar to The Scorpion King. However, the lettering here is actually embossed on both the front and the spines. So that's actually, always really neat to have an embossed logo, or sometimes the very rare debossed logo on the slipcover. This is actually a much older HDR sticker right here, so I'm also very glad that this is a sticker and not a logo, because as a sticker I always have the option to remove. Right now, again, I haven't removed this as of yet because I don't know if the movie is worth more or less if this sticker is on or off it. So just for right now, until I figure that out, I'll keep this on. And then the front of it is also still the same cover. So as like the Scorpion King, I do wish that we did have alternative artwork for The Mummy. I know that the DVD, at least the special edition DVD, did come with a different artwork. The Blu-ray came with a different artwork. And this artwork is actually the poster artwork from back when the movie was being marketed, back in '99. As far as image quality goes between the 4K and the Blu-ray, the 4K is a little bit sharper, but just like the Scorpion King, that's not the main benefit of this disc. The thing about the 4K disc that I noticed immediately in comparison to the Blu-ray is that the textures look better than they did on the Blu-ray. On the Blu-ray, they just looked just a little bit smoothed out. Obviously the Blu-ray quality wise it's going to be better than the DVD, but from Blu-ray to 4K, the textures, such as the textures on the walls, the textures on their clothing, the little toolkit that Rick gives to Evelyn, it is a little bit more detailed and not as scrubbed out or blurry as they looked at in the Blu-ray. So now it's not going to be like an amazing jump where you can automatically tell the textures are a little bit better. It's just kind of more of, if you look for it, you notice that the textures are better processed. Now, unfortunately, I cannot say the same for the textures of the skin. Now, I have a suspicion that this movie is actually just an upscale of the Blu-ray, and not an actual rescanned negative or positive, because when I looked at the images between the Blu-ray and the 4K, pretty much every scene looked similar in terms of these scenes look better here and then these scenes look worse here. Now, the main scene that I want to focus on for the image quality, on why my suspicions are thinking of this as an upscale rather than a rescan, is in the opening scene when you see Anck-su-namun coming into the Pharaoh's chambers. There's a few close-ups of her where, and mind you, this is a close-up, so when they do a close-up, they have to put you in focus. The close-ups on Anck-su-namun are kind of soft. You would think that close-ups would give you better detail, especially on their skin, and if they're going to be, focusing on the eyes, because on the close-up, it's only from neck up. I know that in the Scorpion King, you got to see really good detail, but that was because that's an extreme close-up. Even with just a regular close-up, there should still be pretty good detail. But with Anck-su-namun, her face was actually pretty soft. The textures on her hair were a little bit better than they were on the Blu-ray. The HDR, or the colors for the 4K disc, actually did help it over the Blu-ray, because I was actually able to make out the gold paint on her eyes a little bit better than I did on the Blu-ray. However, her face was still soft. It didn't come with that detail that I would expect from a 4K release. So it's specifically this scene why I think that this is a 4K upscale rather than a rescan, because when I looked at the Blu-ray, it was the exact same thing. She looks soft in the Blu-ray as well. Because of how the images, when I compared them throughout the film, parts that the 4K had the exact same better parts and the exact same softer parts in the 4K as it did in the Blu-ray. So that's why I suspect that this is actually just an upscale and not really true 4K. So if you're buying this movie for the detail, then you're going to be a little bit disappointed, as it's just the detail is a little noticeably better than the Blu-ray. Again, it's mainly with the textures on things such as buildings, clothing, hair, sometimes some of the weapons. But as for anything that would have a smooth surface or anything that would have the skin, it's gonna appear still soft. It's not going to be too much better detail than it is on the Blu-ray. But the benefit that comes with this movie is that color wise, in the gradients, the 4K, the movie does benefit from that in the 4K. So if you buy this movie, just keep in mind it's just more like the aesthetic of the movie looks better rather than the detail. It's funny because the best scenes of the movie, as far as quality, image quality wise, or what the 4K does, I think are actually the first two scenes of the movie. It's, you know, the opening scene with Imhotep with Adeth Bey narrating over it, and then the following scene, which is the first battle at Hamunaptra. Those daylight scenes, they do benefit a lot better being on the 4K because the gradients as far as the HDR is a lot better than it is obviously on the Blu-ray. There was one or two cuts where it showed soldiers, and on one of the soldiers I remember you could see the hairs on his face better than you did on the Blu-ray, but that's because his hairs had texture. But skin wise, it was still about the same amount of detail that it was on the Blu-ray, but everything else still looked great. The CGI for the mummy is actually really well. I think it actually still holds up, especially during the darker scenes, obviously because the CGI blends better. But the scene where he finds Benny and then recruits him into being his subject, I think is actually the best use of that CGI. Now, even though the movie was done in DTSX, I don't know again if this is another new remix. Like, because I have my suspicions that the image is an upscale, I also have a feeling that the audio as well is an upscale. There wasn't many scenes that I want to say particularly jumped out at me that I thought this was really good. As far as audio goes, I think it was fine. I think it was pretty standard. Obviously it doesn't sound terrible, it still sounds good. I can hear the score relatively fine. I can make out all the dialogue relatively fine. The sound effects still sound pretty good. Still, they pop pretty well, but nothing really standoutish. The only one part of the movie that I remember standing out with audio is the part where Imhotep, you know, summons Sandstorm, and he starts trying to swallow the plane. I just remember the plane when it was coming down the cliff and going over. I remember in the audio, it sounds like it actually does go overhead. So that on that part, I think that was pretty good mixing, at least for that little scene. But for the rest of the movie, nothing really actually stand out at me. And again, this is not a bad mix, but it's nothing special either. And now the third movie that we're going to be talking about is The Mummy Returns on 4K Blu-ray. The Mummy Returns was released theatrically in 2001, and it's got its 4K release also at the same time as the first movie in 2017. So packaging wise, even though I don't have the slipcover, I do imagine that the slipcover does look the same as the Scorpion King and the Mummy. Image quality wise, The Mummy Returns is going to be very similar to The Mummy. So overall it is better detail than the Blu-ray, but it's not much of a jump in detail. Again, just like when I compared the 4K and the Blu-ray with this movie, the scenes that looked really good also looked good on the Blu-ray, and the scenes that look really bad also looked bad on the Blu-ray. This is what kind of more or less confirms my suspicions that this was a 4K upscale rather than a new scan of the film. But even so, this 4K is not a terrible release. It does have the benefit, again, of just like the previous two movies, having that gradient in the HDR between the colors and the highlights and the blacks being better balanced, better evened out. Just like in the first movie, the opening scene for this one would actually looked really nice. Everything was nice and bright without being overblown. The shadows still mixed well, nothing was crushed. The detail on the rock, at least in the very first scene that you see him in, was still pretty good. You can see like the little shine and just the very few imperfection of his skin that you can see with the highlights. That was still pretty nice. Again, the textures in The Mummy Returns look pretty well. The textures are the most that benefit from the detail boost over the Blu-ray, not so much the skin or anything with a soft surface. Although I would say one thing that is both a benefit and a negative for these movies is that the CGI in the 4K does make it stand out more in not a good way. You can tell that some of the CGI is dated. On The Mummy, the CGI on the 4K did look dated, but it didn't look too terrible. It still looked like it was mixed in well. But here in The Mummy Returns, the CGI is actually noticeably worse than in the first Mummy movie. I don't know if that was because of back when they made the movie, maybe the technology or the techniques that they made them in wasn't as good. There wasn't anything really that stood out as far as detail goes. Color wise, it looks aesthetically better than the Blu-ray. The one scene that does highlight this the best in this movie is the fight in the Scorpion King's chambers in the end of the movie, both with Rick and Imhotep, and then also when the Scorpion King comes in. So that those entire set pieces look the best as far as the HDR goes, because there are some dark parts in there that mix well with the lighting of the room, and then when the fires pop out, the highlights on that aren't overblown, but they're still pretty bright, and they give still nice warm color to everything else in that room, even to the actors in there. So I think that scene benefits the most as far as being upscaled to 4K. And then as far as audio, again, it's also DTSX, and the Blu-ray is DTS HD. So in both mixes, I can tell that the score seemed to have a little bit more emphasis than the dialogue or the sound effects. Now that's not as noticeable in the first Mummy movie, but it's more noticeable here in The Mummy Returns, because The Mummy Returns actually has more action set pieces than the first Mummy. So the score, I noticed that it actually tends to overtake the dialogue and some of the audio by a bit. They're not drowned out, but you notice that the first thing you're going to hear, or the thing you hear the most, is actually going to be the score over dialogue and over sound effects. Overall, the movie is just marginally better than the Blu-ray. So now I'm going to give some brief thoughts about the movies. Now, The Scorpion King, I do kind of like this movie. Obviously I saw this movie back when it came out. I was excited for it because I did like The Rock, even though I wasn't a fan of wrestling, but of him I did like, and usually when I played wrestling video games, I usually always pick The Rock. But even though this movie does share continuity with the Mummy movies, I know it branches off into its own spin-off franchise with the other Scorpion King movies, but I'm not watching those. I thought the villain of the movie was actually pretty alright. I think it could have been utilized a little bit better. But you know, The Rock, he's not exactly the type of character that I thought he was back when I saw The Mummy Returns. So when I saw him in The Scorpion King and the type of character that he was there, I'm thinking, how did he go from the end of this movie to the beginning of The Mummy Returns into a conqueror? So I'm just like, oh, okay, that's quite a jumping character. While The Scorpion King is PG-13, the movie does feel a little bit almost like for actually like 12-year-olds. I mean, I shouldn't be surprised about that. The big draw for this movie was The Rock, back when he was called The Rock, because he just left wrestling to pursue a movie career. So a lot of people were coming from wrestling to see The Rock, and a lot of them were actually kids. So I guess that's fine why this movie is a little bit more kid-friendly than the two Mummy movies. It's just that I saw this movie a few times when I was younger. I saw this movie once or twice in this 4K disc, and I think that's about, I had my fill for The Scorpion King. for this, so I don't know when I'll watch this movie again. So even though I kind of the only reason why I bought this movie is just because it has relation to The Mummy Returns, that collector mentality of, because this is connected to that movie and because this actor does show up in the other movie, it's like, okay, I kind of have to get it to at least complete that part of my collection, I guess. It's really a bummer that this movie only has a commentary as a special feature. It doesn't have any deleted scenes. It doesn't have any interviews with The Rock or nothing. It's just a commentary. So that, I just think it's actually a real loss for this movie. I think that I think the production for this movie was interesting into how they went from going from The Mummy Returns into actually giving The Rock his own spin-off, and then that went into its own franchise. So it's just very unfortunate that this doesn't have special features. Now, as for The Mummy, I actually, like I said, this one is actually my favorite of the three movies. I actually do remember watching this movie in theaters, and I actually remember really enjoying this movie. I don't remember really being scared, except for maybe the one scene when the mummy wakes up. The most vivid thing, though, I remember, funnily enough, is the credits of the movie is what I remember the most, watching it in theaters. Now, I almost actually didn't get this movie with the slipcover, because back when I initially bought the movie, I only bought it without the slipcover, and then it was later on that I found a copy that did have the slipcover. So then I went and bought that movie, returned the movie, and kept the slipcover on my original copy because I had already opened that one. You know, the things you have to do to make sure that your collection is the best that you want it to be. So Brendan Fraser, even when I was a kid, I thought that he was one of the more better action heroes, one of the more relatable action heroes, or like even a person that the type of character that he is the type of person that you would want to grow up to be. So even as a kid, I liked him better than Schwarzenegger. I liked him better than Bruce Willis, and even better than Keanu Reeves. I think Brendan Fraser, I think why the internet refers to him as the king, I think there's a reason for him, because he's just a wholesome man, and he just needs to be protected, and he's like a great character and a person, and yeah. And then Rachel Weisz is really great. The chemistry that these two have is amazing, and like, oh, she's just so adorable, especially during the library scene. And then when she's drunk and she says like, oh, she's very proud to be a librarian. She's probably one of my early crushes, on-screen crushes, because oh my gosh, she's one of the most beautiful women I've seen. This movie, I think, actually has the best filmmaking of any from its entire franchise. And the reason why I say that is because this feels a lot like a movie that would have been made back in like the 1940s or the 1950s, or whenever those monster movies were coming out. So if you actually have the settings on your TV to make this movie look like a black and white movie, and I don't mean just desaturating the color, I mean actually adjusting everything to make it look like this movie was made for black and white, I think this actually would fit really well. So, you know, if there is ever like a fan version where somebody was like, oh, okay, they made a black and white version, kind of similar like with Justice League, where that has the color version, and then it was also recolor graded for its black and white. I think if you did the same thing with this movie, I think that aesthetic would also fit it really well, because it just has that feel to it. I even remember when I used to go to a relative's, I would always put on their movie on, I think it was actually VHS. Now, I am unfortunately very sad on The Mummy Returns because I did not get this movie with the slipcover. So when I put these three together, it's the only movie without the slipcover. It feels really incomplete not having it, you know, along my wall with the slipcover. I know I have some movies without slipcovers, but the ones that I have without slipcovers, I think are the ones that are just individual releases, and this is like a part of a franchise. So when I have those in slips and this without the slip, I just feel really sad that I don't have the slip cover for it. Maybe one day. I actually really like Odeth Fer as Areth Bey in this movie better because I think he has more screen time in this movie. I liked him in the first one, but with this one I got to see more of him, so that was really cool. It was really great to see that Anubis fight back when I saw it in theaters. Although watching it now, it's not as spectacular as I thought it was back then, but that's because back then big action sequences like that, we didn't quite narrow it down to be as spectacular as we do in present day. Rachel Weisz actually, she does have a little bit of a change in her character. She actually looks more confident in this movie, but I guess that's because, in the movie she got married to Rick, and then she had a kid, and then she had these adventures, but she's still the same, more or less, core character. She still wants to do things just for its academic sake. In this movie we finally get to see Rick and Imhotep finally duke it out. I know that they had a little bit of a fight, even though it was a little more of a curb stomp in the first Mummy movie. So when I saw the trailers for this movie, and then when I saw it in theaters and got to see these two actually go hand to hand, that was like really, really cool. Just because also in the Mummy video game, that's actually a level where you get to fight the other person depending on what character that you are. The chemistry between Rick and Evelyn is still pretty good, and we see a little bit more of the Mummy in human form this time. We also get to see Anck-su-namun come into the movie. What I always found a little bit weird with Anck-su-namun is that, so Anck-su-namun and Evelyn are reincarnations of past Anck-su-namun, and when Evelyn was Nefertiti back then. So what I found weird about Anck-su-namun in the present day one, or at least the one in The Mummy Returns, is that person, once they got the soul back of Anck-su-namun, I was like, did that person cease to be? And then the soul of Anck-su-namun now inhabits that person's body? Or did that soul then merge with this new person's soul, but they have now the memories of Anck-su-namun, so now that new person is that person plus Anck-su-namun? Or does Anck-su-namun now is taken over and this person is now, I guess, integrated into Anck-su-namun? So it's like that I always found a little bit weird, because it's just like, which is this person? Is this person from when they were born in their present day, or is this person now no longer alive and it's Anck-su-namun who is now in the body? So that I always just found really weird. The Rock in this movie, surprisingly, I think was actually pretty good. Him as the Conqueror. It's pretty weird to see how he acts in this movie and then how he acts in Scorpion King. Again, they just kind of almost feel like two different characters, but also, like, I know that the Scorpion King and The Mummy Returns actually do have quite a bit of period, quite a bit of a time in between each other, at least the beginning scene of The Mummy Returns, from his conquest to, and also the beginning of the Scorpion King, or at least the end of the Scorpion King, from when he becomes the king. The 4K did not do CGI Scorpion King any favors. In the 4K, he looks really standoutish. He looks very smooth. Well, I mean, because of the lighting, it does help him feel like he actually is in the room, but he just feels very like a lot of people say, very much like a video game character. But I don't want to say that's entirely terrible, because I'm still immersed enough in the film that is like, okay, yeah, I can see if they had done this effect better, it would still be, you wouldn't take me out of the film. It's just the effect is just dated now, so that's still unfortunate. Okay, so the reason why I'm not reviewing The Mummy Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is because, again, I don't have that 4K disc, but I didn't buy it because even though it does belong to part of the Mummy franchise and it is the third in the Mummy, it doesn't really feel to me like it's part of the same world. Like, obviously, yeah, there's mummies, there's the same characters, but the previous three movies, the two Mummy movies and the Scorpion King, were all set in Egypt or Egypt theme, and then this one then moves to China, and then Rachel Weisz didn't return for this movie. The kid, I know he probably would have been grown by the time they made Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, but you know, he's not returning either. I think the only two actors that returned for The Mummy was Brendan Fraser and John Hannah. That was his name back when I watched it in theaters during its initial release. I only hesitantly watched it because it was Brendan Fraser and it had the title of The Mummy, but it didn't feel the same. So even though I guess I could probably enjoy that movie now, it doesn't feel connected to its previous three movies, especially just because a lot of what made the first two movies special is the connection and the chemistry between Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, and because she's not there, it just doesn't feel the same to me. That's kind of the only reason why I didn't buy Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, although I did hear from reviews of that disc that of all of these discs, that one looks the best, but probably just because that one was the most recent one, filmed with the most recent technology. But by recent, I mean the movie came out in I think 2008. So that is my discussion on the Mummy movies plus the Scorpion King on 4K Blu-ray. If you don't have these movies or only had the DVD versions of them, then yeah, I would recommend that you upgrade these movies. If you have the Blu-ray versions of them, I can't really see a good justification for you upgrading to the 4Ks unless you just want the movies to look aesthetically better and that slight boost in detail. Then sure, I would say go get these movies. I think you could still buy these movies individually online, but in stores, I don't see them. I don't see them in stores anymore. The only thing that I see in stores now is just the Mummy Trilogy collection, and I think the 5-film Scorpion King collection. Overall, I'm generally happy that I have these movies because I never had them before. So having them now, I was able to get them at least in the best physical format available at the time. It's just my collector mentality of wanting these movies in the best available format, even though they're a little bit more expensive for not much more benefit than what you would get them in the Blu-ray. But I'm still overall happy that I have them because these movies are still enjoyable for me, and I'm planning on watching these again. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed me talking about my movie collection. You know, I still have plenty more here to talk about. As I said in my previous video, I still have a few projects in the works. So even though I think what I'm going to be talking about, a majority of my videos is going to be on movies and my collection, I am still going to do other projects on the side, such as video games, and I'm actually planning to do a video game playthrough. If that interests you, then I hope that you'll stay tuned for whenever I post those playthroughs. So if you enjoyed watching my content and my discussions, then please come back for a future video, and I'll see you all next time.
It's like the dirtiest way of playing this.